Hey guys, welcome back to another video. This is Troy with Cichlid Bros. In today's video we're giving a care guide and species profile on the Blue Dolphin Cichlid. This is a beautiful Lake Malawi African cichlid with some very unique characteristics, so we're excited to talk about it a little bit more, so let's dive right in. So the Blue Dolphin Cichlid, or the cyrtocara moorii, is a beautiful Lake Malawi African cichlid. And when you're looking at Lake Malawi, it really falls into three main categories with your mbuna, your peacocks, and your haplochromis. The blue dolphin falls in the haplochromis family, and it's also one of the more common haps versus the predatory type that gets much bigger and sometimes more aggressive. The blue dolphin can also get a little bit aggressive, but we'll talk about that in a little bit. The main characteristics that you'll see right away with the Blue Dolphin Cichlid is the coloration, the forehead, face, and mouth. So it obviously gets the nickname Blue Dolphin because it does look like a dolphin. And as they mature, especially males, will get that big nuchal hump with that rounded grayish blue forehead. Both males and females will get that brilliant light blue coloration in their bodies, and when they're young they'll have a little bit of black splotching in their body, but the males especially will lose that completely as they grow into maturity. The Blue Dolphin Cichlid shares the same water parameters as any other cichlid that comes from Lake Malawi, so that includes higher pH, harder water, temperatures that are around 78 degrees, so I would recommend a heater. And when it comes to your water parameters, we really just recommend keeping things as consistent as possible and not chasing your pH or your hardness levels. Blue dolphins are relatively hardy cichlids, so as long as you keep your tanks cycled and you keep your nitrates below 40 parts per million with no nitrites and no ammonia, they should be just fine in almost all water parameters, especially if they're tank bred, which most fish in the hobby today are. Good water movement is definitely great for these guys, and they have a very specific aquascape because they are open water swimmers. And in terms of the tank setup, I would recommend sand, crushed corals, or crushed shells. And if you go with a aragonite sand like I have here, it buffers that pH, keeping it higher. So if you do have lower pH in your area, the aragonite sand is a great consistent way of keeping that pH a little bit higher. And in terms of scape, I believe it should be pretty minimal. I have just some rocks in the middle of my tank because I have peacocks and haps, and like I said, they're very much open water swimmers. If you have mbuna, it can be really tricky because mbuna prefer the rock caves and structures, so I would recommend keeping them with more of your haplochromis or peacock species. You know, you can go up to something like the predatory haps like the Malawi hawk, the nimbochromis, the Malawi trout. Things like that would probably work well with it. Or you can go with some of the other common haps like the star sapphire, the red empress, the Taiwan reef, the Madoka white lips are all great options. And then I would say all the different peacocks would be great tank mates for them. The next tier of tank mates would probably be some of your bottom dwellers like your Synodontis catfish, your plecos, maybe clown loaches. Some of those that stay out of the way and maybe can hide in the nooks and crannies of the light rockscape you have going on. All those would work well with the Blue Dolphin. And yes, hypothetically, the Blue Dolphin Cichlid could be kept with American cichlids, but it's really hit or miss in that regard because they do have very specific tank setup requirements, and I've seen them bully different American cichlids and get bullied by some depending on the species. It's just a toss-up in my opinion if that's going to work. So if you're going to try that, just be very wary. I would just recommend an ideal setup being more Lake Malawi haps and peacocks. And the Blue Dolphin Cichlid does get pretty large. The males will get around 10 inches in length, with the females maybe being around 8 inches. And they are very active swimmers, so that open water swimming space is very important. But that also means you need a pretty big tank as well. So if you're just going to keep a small group of blue dolphins, for instance, you would probably need at least a 75-gallon tank. But ideally, you're keeping them in a 6-foot long, maybe a 125 or larger. And like I have in my 135, there's a mix of peacocks and haps, and it's really a perfect size for them. They will get pretty big, they'll get bigger than most of those peacocks, but they're kind of modest in size when it comes to some of the larger predatory haplochromis. And if you do have them in the right tank setup and tank size, the aggression level of the Blue Dolphin really isn't too bad. It's probably labeled as semi-aggressive in my opinion. They're usually going to be just fine. They do have some conspecific aggression. They might go after some similar looking species, like if you have multiple blue dolphins, they might pick at each other. or if you have a star sapphire or Madoka white lips, for instance, both of those look pretty similar with the blue coloration, and sometimes they might pick on each other. But if you have the right tank size and setup, that probably shouldn't lead to any major issues. You might just have a little bit of light chasing here or there. And another thing to keep in mind with aggression when it comes to African cichlids like haps and peacocks is if you want to limit the aggression, potentially go with an all-male cichlid tank, and you won't have nearly as much fighting in the tank. If you do introduce a few females, they could fight over those females. If you're going to have a mix of males and females, I would recommend a higher ratio of females to males. So if you have one blue dolphin, maybe get up to 5 or 6 female blue dolphins to kind of dissipate that aggression, and you should hopefully be okay. But overall, the blue dolphin cichlid won't be too aggressive most times. When it comes to feeding the blue dolphin cichlid, it's very straightforward. I would recommend just a high protein based diet. So I go with extreme big fella or peewee pellets for the blue dolphin, mixing in some krill flakes as well. And you could also mix in some vegetable based foods as well, just to give them a rounded diet. But they'll really eat anything, you really don't have to worry about that. When it comes to something like Malawi bloat, that's really in regards to most mbuna, where the peacocks and haps are much more predatory based and need that higher protein based content. But even though they don't eat a ton of vegetable based foods in the wild, if you do put live plants in your tank, they'll likely be shredded up by the blue dolphin. Like any of the 3 main categories of Lake Malawi cichlids, even your hardiest of plants will likely be ripped apart or destroyed over time. Even something like a Nubius, I've tried with mine, and they eventually shred it up and it dies. So I would just recommend saving your money there. You could put some fake plants in there if you like, or you could go with Escape like me, where it's just more rock base and sand and crushed shells, and that looks great to me. The fish themselves really become the decoration in your tank with those brilliant colors. The blue dolphin having that bright blue color pattern with that awesome nuchal hump, kind of whitish and gray lips and mouth, and then mixing them with other types of peacocks and haps can just give you all the different colors that you could imagine in a cichlid tank. And it's really like a moving painting in your tank. I just love the activity, the colors, and the behaviors of African cichlids, and the blue dolphin is no different. When it comes to breeding the blue dolphin, like most African cichlids, it's a pretty straightforward process. You really just need a male and female in the tank. Your odds of getting that pair will just increase if you have a bigger group, especially if you have more females. You're much more likely to have a pair form and start breeding. Just know if they're going to be breeding, they're going to be much more aggressive and territorial in your tank. But once that pair forms, the female will lay eggs, and then she'll take those eggs into her mouth, and she'll usually keep them for a couple weeks before spitting out the fry. And if you have a big community of cichlids, those fry probably won't last very long in the tank. So if you do want to raise those fry, I would recommend taking out that female and letting her spit out the fry in a separate tank, and then maybe taking that female and putting her back into the display tank. And those fry might take a little bit longer than some of your other peacocks and haps to grow. I would say the blue dolphin cichlid is pretty slow growing compared to some of the other African cichlids. Once they do get to that max size though, they are truly show-stopping fish. And once they start getting that hump as well, they are one of the most recognizable Lake Malawi fish out there. And that's why they're really unique and one of my absolute favorites to keep, and why I have 2 in my 135 gallon tank. So I hope you found that information helpful. And if you have any questions or comments about the blue dolphin cichlid, leave those down in the comment section below. Happy to help. Thanks again for watching, guys, and we'll see you next time.